Continuing Chapter 1 of Part 5. Then calling to the crowd that was near, Jesus said, Hear and understand. There is nothing from without the man which, entering into him, can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are what defile the man. The comparison of this address to the multitude with the speech to the Pharisees shows to us that Jesus would not be understood as undervaluing purity in any sense, as not abolishing any law which God had given, but that purity was not to be attained and maintained by outward washings and by observance of what meats a man should eat, but rather by keeping the soul, the source of life, all clean. But this is expressed in a parable. So in a way, that's like the left-hand path. Not that you violate the outward, but you're focused on manifesting this inner thing. And then what you're taking in, you're not violating any terms. But it also removes victim blaming of various sorts. That, if it's not your inner doing, his disciples told him that he had offended the Pharisees by his speech to them. He answered, Every plant which my heavenly Father hath not planted shall be rooted up. Let them alone, they are blind leaders. And if a blind man lead a blind man, both shall fall into the ditch. Which reply seems to mean that whatever might come to him from so doing, he should not hesitate to root up such noxious weeds as these false teachers, but seems also to imply that no special violence would be requisite. Do you see a blind man leading a blind man? There is a pit in their path. Why should one push them forward? They are going to destruction of themselves. So of these false teachers, and alas, of their followers. But when they reached the house, Peter, who still had traditionary ideas and regarded the manner of eating as not an indifferent subject, asked his master to explain to the disciples this parable about the food. And he said, Are you yet also without understanding? They had been so near him, had so long heard his expressions of thought, that they should have been able at once to know what he meant, and not compel him to go into a detailed explanation, which, however, he does not withhold. Do you not understand that whatsoever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and is evacuated into the draught? But the things coming out of the mouth come from the heart, and they profane the man. You're not supposed to secularize anything, right? Of course they mean defile, but for out of the heart come forth evil purposes, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false testimonies, blasphemies. These are the things that profane a man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not. This consistent with all his teachings, that a man's purity must be that of the character diffused through the whole life. It was quite apparent now that the Jewish ecclesiastical authorities meditated extreme measures. I put the word mediated, but Mark 7 and Matthew 15 are what some of this is going to go off of. The labors of Jesus and his apostles had been exhaustive. There was a fearful ordeal in advance of them. Jesus manifestly saw that, whether it was apparent to the others or not, his field of operations was daily more and more circumscribed by his enemies. He could not walk in Judea, nor in Galilee, without being beset by his ecclesiastical foes. Capernaum could no longer be a retreat to him. It seemed that in view of these things Jesus meditated a season of retirement, and so withdrew his disciples up towards the confines of Phoenicia, designated in Matthew and Mark by the names of the two principal cities, Tyre and Sidon. I don't know whether it's, or Omicron, right? It has been a question whether Jesus ever crossed the boundary of his native country during his public ministry. It is not necessarily implied in the words of Matthew and Mark. Into the coasts, into the borders of Tyre and Sidon. The word may be as well translated towards or unto or as into, that he declared his ministry to be confined to the Jewish people is clear. Does not touch the question, because he was seeking a place where he might, for a season, have recuperative repose, which he could better find in a heathen country. Well, heathen is not the word to use, because certainly why did the prophets come? Oh, well, the religious order has been corrupted, and therefore people are turning their back on God and don't have enough guidance to do otherwise, right? So he was addressing the Goyim, right? In which he did not intend to preach. Now the question has been settled, but the recently discovered Codex Sinaiticus, the text of which in Mark 7:31 is, and again going from the coast of Tyre, he went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, through the midst of the coast of Decapolis. Now, what year in the 1800s was that text discovered? But this is an illustration of Tyre here. Of a woman of this country, one of the most touching of all the stories in the New Testament history is narrated. Jesus sought retirement. He went into a house and took measures to prevent persons from seeking him. But he could not be hid. Some report of his power had crossed the frontier and reached the ears of a woman in those coasts. She now heard that Jesus, a descendant of that great Jewish king. There's a little bit of conflict in the Bible about the ancestry, but who was the wonderful Solomon's father, a worker of many cures, the most beneficent of prophets, was in the neighborhood. Her daughter was strangely and fearfully afflicted, and her countrymen, in common with the Jews, believed in demoniacal possession. She had nothing but this great affliction to commend her to the attention of Jesus. Everything was against her. Her nationality was an offshoot of that base Canaanitish stock. Is it spelled with a Q, or I don't remember how it's spelled, but a lot of these forms that God had aforetime doomed utter destruction. Well, if God doomed them to destruction, how are they still around, right? But which had been spared by the weakness of the ancestors of the people to whom Jesus belonged. That they didn't exterminate the other ethnic groups. Well, no wonder why there's all this call for supporting Ukraine, right? Because the Ukrainian government wants to do away with the Teutonic, the Western European people, and they also want to do with the there's 6 tribes that they put into the country of Ukraine, and they're the Azov battalion wants to do away with the others. So it's not weakness to not drive out the people, the different racial and even ethnic groups. That's not weakness to let some of them live, right? She was a Syro-Phoenician. Then, in her creed, she was a Greek. Well, Greek, Roman, whatever, they believed a variety of things, monotheism, polytheism, different types was pretty much common throughout the ancient world. It's, even though some countries, one type or the other, and types of the one, the popularity of certain things varied, but so she had in her veins the blood of 3 hated races: Greek, Syrian, and Phoenician. Well, that's a different race. We're talking about the Hyperboreans, through Kiev, some centuries before Jesus, they went through, and the writing started to get straighter, because there was rune-like language up in Russian places, and in places like that. But and her religion was against her in her appeal to the Jewish prophet. Well, what people actually believe, whichever actual portion of things, and honestly, if they're going to shrines and this, and if they're not particular about one particular thing like that or another, it's not as against things as people think. But her grief and love for her daughter transcended all such considerations. She sought Jesus and found him, and fell at his feet and besought him, saying, "O sir, David's son, pity me, for my daughter is grievously demonized." For the first time in his career, Jesus seemed untouched by the plea of suffering. Well, was it suffering, or was it, just difficulty? He paid no attention to the suppliant at his feet. He answered her not a word, but she followed him, prosecuting her pleadings. At length the disciples put in a word in her behalf. "Dismiss her, for she cries after us." That this word was in her favor is manifest from the reply of Jesus, but it seems to have come rather from a desire to be rid of her importunity than from any special regard for the poor petitioner. The reply was another discouragement to the agonized mother. "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." This reminded them of the limit of their own commission, and perhaps recalled to them the fact that Jesus had made no cures of any heathen. Well, see, so somebody seeking a prophet is an oracle, but they don't have the faith that aligns with that. That was the issue. It did not positively say that he would not grant their request and hearken to her prayer, but that if he did so, it would transcend the limits of his mission and theirs. To the woman, it must have sounded like a fresh repulse. She had, however, made her daughter's case her own, with such motherly sympathy that when she opened her petitions to Jesus, it was in the pathetic appeal, "Pity me," as if she were the sufferer. Such love is unconquerable. She could not go back to her daughter with no relief. The picture of the paroxysms of the wretched patient goaded her maternal heart to utmost effort. Again she worshipped him. Again she cried, "O sir, help me," as if she had said, "I cannot go wholly unhelped. If my daughter cannot be utterly cured, do something for me. I leave it to your wisdom and goodness to decide what." Jesus again repulsed her by a speech embodying a picture from domestic life. His first word to her was, "It is not a fair thing to take the bread of the children and throw it away, waste it on the little dogs." And so again, if you're just looking for a miracle worker, but you don't have faith in the spiritual movement, all the history of Jesus shows the fineness of his organization. It is a remembrance of this which must help us here. With what tone and look did Jesus utter this speech? To fancy that he meant that this anxious mother at his feet was a dog would be a wretched forgetfulness of the whole spirit of Jesus, thus far manifested in his words and works, especially in his treatment of women. He did not mean that. Well, whoever it was meant what they said. And of course, there were different Jesus characters that we, if we look in history. So, and Jesus sounds more like a formula. It's some odd second person form of "oh thou," or it's not really a term for Joshua. The woman knew, and the disciples knew. The Jews were accustomed to apply the unhandsome epithet of dog to all heathens. He never could have called any woman a whelp. Or could he? Or again, at least one of them. But heathen, pagan, infidel, it's not the same thing as being of a different faith. So let's kind of drop some of these terms that have made their way into the Bible, or that the Quran doesn't have any term that translates into that, and people like to put it in translations because the Christians are all pagan and heathen and all that. None but the grossest of all gross men ever apply this word to any woman, and then they conceive her to be the basest of all based women. There is nothing here to justify this interpretation. He was simply reminding them of what the Pharisees and scribes would say if he should help this woman, and also presenting to them in concrete words the abstract but vigorous prejudices of their own hearts against all peoples who are not of their nation. And see, we like to have translations in the Bibles about the nations. It's like, that's not what they were saying. It wasn't some opposition to other nations. Oh, sure, there's 2 verses that support the blood and soil Zionism, but the Zionism of the Bible is like, what, 165 verses that oppose that view? Some say about 200. I don't remember. There was 165, but then there were 2 verses that don't have the word Zion, I don't think. Anyways, we're not of their nation, as if he had said, you know that the Jews are Jehovah's, they wouldn't say the J or the V sound, peculiar children, not literal, of course, and that this woman is a dog of the Canaanite. Would you have your master outrage all decency and orthodoxy by helping her? Well, there's a difference between true orthodoxy and just being conservative, right? The coldest of most unpoetic historians might fancy that a faint smile of pity for their narrowness passed over this now benignant feature as he uttered these gently satirical words.